a definition of what is culture and cultural background following a very psychological perspective. Okay. Today we're going to talk about cultural psychology, provide you a brief history of what is cultural psychology and how psychologists investigate culture. Then we'll briefly talk about mind and culture, so how our brains play a very important role on incorporating the messages and the information that we get from a cultural background. And I will finish my lecture by talking about cultural learning and cultural evolution. So, in case that you are not familiar with cultural psychology as a discipline was established in the late 80s, early 90s. Uh, it started as a stem of social psychology, as a sub-specialization, let's say, of social psychology. But nowadays, cultural psychology is is a direction in psychology that does not incorporate only social psychology, but also incorporates aspects of cognitive psychology, behavioral psychology, and to a certain extent, even neuropsychology. Um, the important role of culture upon psychology was always a topic of investigation for psychologists, and that stems, even from the late 19th century. William Woods, who is the father of psychology, the founding father of psychology as a discipline, in his research, he tried to investigate what is the role of culture and cultural background on human psychological processes. However, as I said earlier, cultural psychology as a distinct discipline established in the late 80s and 90s. Now, what is cultural psychology? Now, in order to explain to you what is cultural psychology, I'm going to use an analogy between cultural psychology and general psychology. So in general psychology, the focus are in universal concepts. The human brain is being perceived, is being viewed as the CPU of a computer. The goal of general psychology is to understand what are the processes going on, happening at the brain. Cultural psychology focuses on cultural variation. Cultural psychology focuses on how culture and a cultural background plays a very important role on how we shape our thoughts, feelings, emotion, cognition, and personality. So cultural psychology is the investigation, is the study of when culture meets mind. Okay, so for cultural psychologists, humans are being always perceived as active agents working, functioning, studying, living in cultural environments. Now, you might ask me, Panos, okay, thank you very much for the definition of what is cultural psychology, but what is culture? Okay, now, uh, uh, you are students in a school of social sciences, if I am correct. And within the School of Social Sciences, there are a lot of different disciplines, psychology, sociology, anthropology, politics, and in some cases, even economics. If you ask social scientists from 5 different disciplines to give you a definition of what is culture, they will come up with 5 different definitions. Okay, there is not an overall agreement. Let's say there is an overall agreement of what culture can be. Okay, but between social scientists, there is not an overall agreement about a strict definition, of what is culture. Okay. However, for the purposes of today's lecture, I'm going to use a definition of culture which is more psychological, let's say, than sociological. Okay, so the definition of culture that I'm using here, it might be a definition that you have not seen in the past, especially in courses that they're dealing with sociology or anthropology. So for psychologists, culture is two things, it's two main things. First of all, culture is a source of information. Okay, it's information that the humans acquire from other people through social learning. Okay, so for psychologists, culture is the societal structure, that social structure, that overall social structure that is beyond our families, our social groups, our immediate community, that provides information through social learning about who we are. And what is this information? This is information is it can be things like language, important things like language, all the way to how we build things, the food that we ate, the customs that we have, even how we style our clothes and our hair. All those are important information that derive and come from culture. The second thing that is really important about when we define culture for psychologists is that culture is a group of individuals. Okay, cultures is about having a shared context, a shared cultural information. Okay, a shared understanding. Culture can be very broad. Uh, 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 for example, Western culture is a very broad term, or it can be very specific, like Indian culture, or even more specific, Punjabi culture. Okay, so culture can be something broad and specific at the same time. Now, culture is not an easy to study phenomenon. And what is even harder is to study culture's effects on human psychological processes. Okay, there are a lot of challenges while we are studying culture. The first challenge is cultural boundaries are vague. Okay, we are being exposed to a variety of cultural ideas all the time. For example, look at Coca-Cola consumption. Okay, Coca-Cola is it's something that is being associated with Western, let's say, civilization, and especially American culture. But at the same time, as you can see in this map here, is a cultural artifact, a cultural product that is being consumed all around the world. So sometimes, those boundaries of defining culture can be very hard to be defined. The second challenge in studying culture has to do with the fact that culture changes over time. Culture is never static. Culture changes all the time. So, what we perceive today something as being culturally important, maybe in few years is not. Look, for example, the way that we are reading news. Yeah, in the 19th century, as you can see in the picture on the left, people were consuming information. They were learning the news from newspapers. Where nowadays, this is a picture from the Tube in London. Where nowadays, people rely to the mobile phones to consume information. Okay, so the cultural artifacts change all the time. The way that we perceive the way that we perceive things also change culturally. For example, what is being perceived as beautiful in the Western world has been changed significantly the last 20 or 30 years. The third challenge on studying culture is the considerable within culture variation. Okay, so even if you say, I'm going to study a specific culture, let's say Indian culture. Okay, there is a lot of considerable within variation within India. I had the pleasure to visit your university and to visit India, I think 1.5 years ago. It was before the pandemic. Okay, and I had the pleasure to travel all around India, from the north, from Punjab, all the way to Kerala. And even if India has its own culture, there was a great within cultural variation also within India. For example, the foods that they were eating in South India, in Kerala, the food that people were eating in South India and Kerala, was very different from the food that people were eating in the Punjab region. Okay, so cultural psychologists, when they study culture, they need to take under consideration within cultural variation. Okay, and within cultural variation is not only an important factor for Asian cultures, like cultures in like let's say the example of India that I used earlier, but also Western cultures. USA, for example, is not a culturally homogeneous country. Okay, the southwest states of USA, uh, culturally, they are considerably different, let's say, from the east coast states of USA. So we need to keep those three challenges in mind as we go forward. And we need to keep these challenges in mind always when we study culture, not only as a psychologist, but also as a social scientist. So culture boundaries are vague, cultures change over time, and there is considerable within cultural variation. Now, for the second part of my lecture, I'm gonna talk with you about how mind intertwines with culture. Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to draw uh, either on a piece of paper or on your computer, whatever is more convenient for you. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to draw those three boxes. Okay, so draw one large box like this one here with a line, and draw also two smaller boxes labeled as absolute and relative. Okay, so draw those on a piece of paper. I'll give you 5 minutes to draw those boxes.